So welcome. Oh, hello. That's working now. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, especially given as we're up against sex spies and the bomb. I think with such titillating competition, you have made the right choice. I'm also assured that it's cooler in here. Is it? Excellent. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Clare Elcombe. I'm the Director of Humanist Care for Humanists UK. So I oversee all of our core work around pastoral care, around supporting apostates, all of the things that we do for supporting people in difficult points in their lives. And I'm delighted to have Emily Kenway here with us today to talk about her new book. So by way of introduction, and I'm going to read this to make sure I don't miss anything, Emily's a writer and a researcher with a background in campaigning and policy work. Her second book, and the one that we're discussing today, is entitled Who Cares? The Hidden Crisis of Caregiving and How We Solve It. And it weaves the story of her own experience caring for her mother with in-depth research and interviews with caregivers from all around the world, as far afield as Nepal, Norway and Nebraska. It's received widespread acclaim since its publication just a month ago, including being shortlisted for the Orwell Prize for political writing. Emily's writings appeared in The Guardian, The Washington Post, Huffington Post, Times Literary Supplement, and many more. And when she's not working on articles and books, Emily's completing a PhD at the University of Edinburgh on social policy. So, I'd really like to start by just saying thank you to Emily, actually. I am not a great reader of physical books. Last year, I read 2. And this year I read Emily's in a week because it's really timely, it's really personal. You managed to be very vulnerable in it, but at the same time bringing in that really robust research, finding some solutions for problems, and really exploring in great detail the crisis that is growing within caregiving. So one of the most stark things for me, which you explore in the book, is how we as a society we don't have an understanding or an awareness around caregiving beyond the parent-child situation. And given that it will actually affect all of us in one way or another at one point, why do you think that is?
Well, firstly, thank you so much for having me. I think Clare's work is incredibly important at the Humanists, and I was actually aware of it long before I was ever in touch with them about the book, or indeed before the book was, really a book or anything. So, I want to acknowledge your work. Why is it that we don't have a kind of social conversation or understanding about this kind of care? When I say this kind of care, I mean caring for people who are long-term unwell, elderly, or impaired, although we might also apply it to short-term illness, just this notion that we're vulnerable and we get sick and we're needy. Where is that in our social and political narrative? And I think it's missing for a few reasons. I think it's partly missing because of historical gender imbalances, right? So, women were just assumed, middle-class women anyway, were just assumed not to be working and to be available at home to provide that free care. So it kind of wasn't a political object in that way, right? Because it was just dealt with. There also was less of it in the past, right? Because people weren't living for as long. Certain diseases, you would have died more quickly than you do today. So there wasn't as much as a rationale to develop the narrative. Perhaps more importantly than any of that, and this is why there's an unlikely chapter in the book about psychology, which, is not what people seem to expect in a book about care. They think it's going to be about local authorities or something. It's not, it's much more exciting. There is a chapter in there about psychology because there is plenty of research showing that we are actually, scared of thinking and talking about this topic for very deep-seated psychological reasons, because of course it's about entropy and illness and death, it's about fragility. Not only is that uncomfortable at a political level for us today, because we live in a world obsessed with kind of believing in this individualist version of freedom, but also it's scary because obviously none of us want to become impaired, unwell, and die. It's something that people are very afraid of. And that chapter in the book is deeply researched, but the kind of light bulb for me being like, there's got to be a chapter on this in the book, was as a carer, mentioning what was going on with my mum or whatever, and watching people kind of recoil and freak out about this topic being brought up. And I mean, I wasn't doing it in a really insane, oversharing way either, right? And I was like, that's interesting. And then through the interviews I was doing with carers, people say this again and again. People have backed away from me. People have stopped talking to me, this discomfort. Lo and behold, there's loads of social psychological experimentation that also actually bears it out. Yeah. And so I think that's why it's much easier to talk about parenting, because parenting is very hard and is fundamentally a positive, right, for most people.
Yes. I think one of the things that Emily and I were talking about when we were preparing for this was, I hope that from a humanist perspective, we might feel more comfortable with this sort of conversation. I mean, thinking about caregiving, because having faced up to your own mortality and thought about we only have one life, there's nothing else beyond it, we have to make the most of where we are now, perhaps people could feel more comfortable with the reality that we are all going to need care. Many of us are going to be in the position where we're providing care for somebody who we love. And that perhaps that's something that actually humanism as a movement can feed into. Do you think that's something that we could do?
I think it's perfectly possible that having that perspective could support you. There is a lot of research on, so there's something called terror management theory in the social psychology that is about being afraid of dying, basically, and that your worldview is something that can be a protective factor from that fear. So humanism could obviously be that. That being said, I also think this notion of having kind of one life in capitalism, and as we have it today, it can turn into this kind of obsessive carpe diem, I must be a kind of hero while I'm here and create things for my legacy, which can make facing up to mortality really hard, right? Yeah. Because if you haven't done this thing that you felt would kind of make you mean something, and then you're terminally ill, that's very, very difficult.
Yes.
So I think it's probably quite complex, but I think there's definitely potential in there, yeah.
Yeah. I want to pick up on one of the things that you said earlier on about gender, because that was one of the things that really stood out in the book for me, was this gender split around caregiving. And what you said about traditional roles. And I was reflecting on the fact that we've got a generation of women now who are coming towards the point of having to care for their parents, who have been brought up, like you did, by feminists. Yeah. Who have been taught that, we can do everything, we can take on traditional female roles, we can take on traditional male roles, we can have everything. But by comparison, it seems like our brothers and our male counterparts have been brought up to just do the same thing, by and large. So what do you think the answer is in terms of skewing that back to something that's a little bit more equally balanced?
Yeah, I think it's a problem across loads of different issues, actually, that still so many people coming, it's great. The second wave feminism, and so my mum would have been like a classic second wave feminist. I talk about this in the book a bit. Unchaining ourselves from domestic labours, sort of 1970s movements, wages for housework movement, if people are familiar with that. This utter refusal to have our life path dictated because of the gender that's been ascribed to us. And obviously, I have so much respect for that. I'm very glad I was brought up by a strong feminist single mother. But what that kind of turned into over the decades was women needing to be more like men, right? So this idea that the ultimate form of freedom is being able to go out to work, which is kind of hilariously middle class as well. Like, there's only certain jobs that you would ever think that about. And what that means is women are still doing most of the care, right? Because they're just at work as well. It's called the double shift. So you're just doing both those things. And for some women, they're also child caring as well as the kind of care we're talking about. And so in the book, what I talk about is the need to move away from this idea of everyone trying to become the kind of career-driven breadwinner. And I say that with full humility as someone who certainly was brought up to think like that. Moving away from that, and every human being understood as someone who wishes to pursue a sense of purpose, by which I mean to work, notwithstanding loads of jobs do not fit in that definition, but every human wishing, therefore, to do kind of important work and having to provide care. Yes. Whatever gender you are, right? And so therefore, if you design policy from that place, if you design workplace arrangements, what kind of a world do you have? Well, it can't be one where part-time is A, abnormal, or B, means you don't have ambition, right? It can't be one where gaps on your CV are gaps, rather than years where you were doing vital work. That taught you skills, right? So there's all sorts of shifts that creates so that you then have gender, it's a kind of gender neutral approach, I say in the book, right? That everybody becomes both of those things. I do just want to add one of the things that I talk about in the book and I felt was really important and I hadn't really seen articulated anywhere on care, was that most of the campaigns and kind of political conversations, such as they are about this kind of care, focus on how unfair it is that women are having to provide the care in the home, right? And of course it is unfair that we just have that dictated to us. But actually there's two stories of women in care. There's the story of the middle-class white woman who has been kept in the home, you know, having to leave careers and jobs to provide that care at home. And there's the historical story of enslaved women, which translates into underprivileged women of colour today and migrant labourers who don't even have the opportunity to be with their loved ones because they're busy doing that poorly paid, rights-deprived labour. And so when we argue for the right not to provide care, we have to remember that there are other women in our struggle who have not even had the right to be with their loved ones, right? Yeah. And so the only answer I'm interested in is one that works for everyone. Yes. And not one that someone like me would just hire a poorly paid migrant worker from a country in the global south to do my family care for me with her family back home, not then having that support. That's what academics call a care chain or care extractivism, which is what it sounds like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the interesting things when you talk to people about the solutions to the crisis in caregiving. The solutions that they come up with so often are, well, we need more paid care workers. We need, you know, more institutions that can provide care. We need services that can come in and do this. People don't look at, we need to enable people to be able to care for the people who they love.
Right, exactly.
We don't, you know, we're not talking about building societies where people care for each other. And I think that was one of the really interesting things with the people that you interviewed in the book, was that you had this really difficult truth for them, that actually caregiving was incredibly difficult for them. It was really hard, it was emotionally stressful, it was physically stressful, they weren't getting enough sleep. But at the same time, they desperately wanted to be able to do it. And taking away that choice from people in care just seems, it seems like the wrong way of solving it.
I mean, this is a core reason why I wrote the book, right? Because I was so often around people who their solution, when they thought about care, which obviously they weren't really because they weren't having to do it, and no one does until they do, but when they thought about it, their ideas were all about kind of outsourcing it. So either to a state service, so this national care service idea, or private companies. Some of my interviewees are in countries where that's more relevant, or technology in the future, right? And I find it to be this like deep-seated misunderstanding of what care is actually like and how it happens. Because yes, of course, certainly, especially with more advanced forms of some illnesses like dementia and so on, yes, you need paid professionals and you do need that support, and you need it anyway, right? Because the physical and mental impacts are so extreme if you're doing it 24/7. But it doesn't really matter what arrangement we have that isn't us to provide care, National Care Service, paid companies, whatever. We will always also be doing a substantial proportion of that care ourselves. And there are 4 reasons for this that I hope I explain very clearly in the book, because I felt like it really needed to be said. One is that the body, when it's sick or impaired, is very erratic and unpredictable. And there is a degree of planability you need with those kinds of services that doesn't match neatly with that kind of unpredictability. So even if, I mean, in my case, even if I'd had loads of state or paid support over those years, I would still have been being pulled out of work all the time, or needing to do nights with her, or needing to, you know, suddenly go there after work and stay a week when I wasn't expecting to, because bodies they're really erratic, right? People are discharged from hospital too soon without a care plan in place, etc., etc. So if you have what I call an embodied understanding of care, it is my understanding of care is in the body, you know that won't work the way that people think it will work. Secondly, people who receive care are also humans who have preferences, and I wonder if there are people in the room who also recognise this point, which is that many people who need care refuse outside help. And this is not, yes, we know this, don't we? Why don't the policymakers pay attention to this? Because the carers know it. There's a kind of darkly hilarious study I found that said that some academics had gone and looked at why people were helping their elderly neighbours, caring for their elderly neighbours in an area. And a substantial proportion of it was because the elderly people had lied when the state tried to see if they needed care support, right? And this is really common, and I respect why. My mum was a massive refuser of outside help, which was very difficult, and I also understand why, because we live in a world obsessed with independence and invulnerability, right? And we don't have any way of respecting ourselves whilst we're vulnerable.
Yes.
Very quickly, thirdly, obviously, lots of people who need care cannot advocate for themselves, cannot do the bureaucracy, etc., etc. So lots of family caring is about basically being a project manager and dealing with services. One of my interviewees is in Norway, where they have loads of services. She has an adult son with very high needs Down syndrome. And she has so many free services, it's amazing. And she told me that you need a first-class degree to access them. You know, she's not a carer. And finally, the point which you touched on, Claire, is that we will always be caring for our loved ones because they are our loved ones. We love them. So we don't want it to be under these circumstances. We don't want it to be this difficult. But love does mean you're going to have to do some care at some point. I think in the book I say, if you love anyone and you're not an asshole, you will be a carer, right? And we don't have, our policy is based on this idea that love doesn't exist.
Yeah, and I think that's something that kind of stands out for me. I'm incredibly lucky at how much I love my job. You know, I've landed somewhere where I feel that, you know, my values and my skills really match up, and I adore what I do. And I would still drop it in a heartbeat to look after my mum when she needs me. And I do feel like that emotional recognition is really missed, that we want to look after these people. In fact, even, you know, we talked very briefly earlier, my dad died 11 years ago. My dad was not a nice person, and I still dropped everything to look after him, because I think as human beings, we want to do that. And I think you refer to them as species activities, don't you? Care is not a sector. It's not this divisible thing from everything else. It's not an economic sector. It's a species activity. Yeah. And we're being told it's an economic sector because it's the only way capitalism can cope with it, basically. So speaking to your point about you love your job, which is great. I love your job. I think it's great. That you would still drop everything, rightly so. One of the solutions coming out of the lovely US of A to the care crisis is something called care.com, which the Sunday Times implied I supported, and I am very rude about it in the book, so I don't know how they managed that. It's basically like Uber for care workers. So your parent who's, you know, unwell, there's suddenly an infection, they need extra attention, extra help, something's happened, they've had a fall, you know, these things. Well, that's fine, because your company has a benefits package that includes some hours with care.com. So you can just click, 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 and send a stranger who may or may not have been vetted well enough, because there's been some interesting cases around that, to go and be there with your loved one who may or may not want them there. But it's fine, because you can keep working. Yeah. When you look at, you know, the UN has done this study that talks about how many work days are lost to care each year. Well, how many care days are lost to work, right? Yeah. It's a radical point, but it is actually where we need to go with policy. Because we are heading for a really frightening future where we are kind of circumscribed from providing care because there are these kind of ridiculous marketized solutions. Yeah. I think it's astonishing, isn't it, that when you look at the solutions, when you look at, you know, our political setup around caregiving at the moment, it is all set around this immovable rock of working for pay in the middle of it, that your economic activity is paramount. You need to fit all of your caregiving in around it, and all of our solutions must fit around the fact that we are workers first and perhaps we're people second. And I think that's one of the things, again, we were talking about the Care Act and the Neonatal Care Act, that are both things that are going through Parliament at the moment, recognising two different aspects of caregiving and the demands that it places upon people, and how they are asking for very different things from employers and different support from the state when it comes to caregivers. So the Care Act is going to give 5 days of unpaid leave as a right to caregivers. So anyone in 1 year can take a whole 5 days.
Unpaid, yeah.
Unpaid. Whereas the Neonatal Care Act, which I must admit I have a vested interest in, I've campaigned for it a number of years ago, but it will offer up to 12 weeks additional parental leave, which is paid for parents of children who are born prematurely. And that just looked to me like this really, really stark demonstration of how we don't understand caregiving, which isn't in that parent-child dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, another one to add to that is that carers allowance, which is for people who are carers and who provide 35 hours or more of care a week and earn less than £139 through paid work. It is £76.75 a week. Statutory maternity pay is £100 more than that a week, which may also not be enough, but you can see the problem. I think the neonatal care provision is really interesting to me. When it came out, I thought about writing something angry about it somewhere, not because I don't agree with it. Obviously, I do. It needs to exist. But then I was like, people are just going to misunderstand what I'm saying if I do this. I'm going to get tweeted angrily. But
possibly by me, to be fair.
No, because I 100% obviously support it. But it's such a to win substantial paid leave for sick babies is like an absolute no-brainer. Like, what kind of moral human society doesn't have that? And it's kind of an example of us, again, choosing to kind of have the kind of acceptable victim, the acceptable thing. Meanwhile, your 55-year-old, really overwhelmed woman who's trying to work part-time, has a parent with dementia, has another parent with Parkinson's or whatever, it's not as palatable. So it's not that I disagree with it at all. For me, it's analogous to where we have migrants campaigns that support the rights of refugees and not any other migrants, right? It's like always sort of cherry picking. And politically, there's a pragmatic argument for that, right? And I'd much rather that we have the neonatal paid leave than that we don't. But I think from an analytical perspective, it says something, right? And it's taken about 12 years, I believe, to win 5 days of unpaid carers leave a year. People have been working on that for over a decade.
Yes.
And so, what the hell? Yes. There is how would we cope with it, though, if they actually paid attention to it properly? You can have dementia for up to 20 years. What kind of leave arrangement would that be? So we kind of can't cope with it.
Yes, so it might have just become this. I think people are worried that it's going to be a Pandora's box.
Yes.
Well, if we start supporting people properly, then it never ends. And how do we budget for that? And how do we manage that as employers and all of those sorts of things? I imagine everybody in this room is reasonably well sold on how difficult caregiving is at the moment and how this crisis is really entrenched. I think some of the solutions that you touched upon in your book were incredibly heartwarming. The setups that you uncovered, Cotham's circles, the commons of care that you talk about, and actually how we as a society can start to look after each other better, I finished your book with a feeling of hope.
That's great.
Around the caregiving sector, which was brilliant. So how do you think we can start taking some steps towards being a society that look after each other better?
Yeah. So I guess there's two bits of this. One bit is that we need different politicians. Like actually... Some of these things, what I'm going to say as things we can do now are kind of things we can do now, right? Therefore, they're inherently voluntary, they're not mandatory, etc. My politics is that we have to actually legislate for these things if we want real change. So notwithstanding that situation, I do think that there are things that we can be thinking about and implementing ourselves in our daily lives. Some of that is in the world of employment, like employers, there is a small and growing movement of employers who are voluntarily choosing to become like carer-friendly workplaces, right? And so I explain some of this in the book briefly, but there are things like obviously having paid leave for carers, having flexible hours. There's something called a carer's passport, where basically it says what your kind of situation is, and you're able to change your working arrangements at very short notice without going through like a hierarchy of management. It would have been incredibly helpful to me to have that, you know. So there are employers, if you're an employer, come on, do something. But then for all of us, I think one of the key things that I talk about in the book is around the notion of community and kind of mutual aid, right? So we know that the nuclear household is not a strong enough structure to cope with our human needs and vulnerabilities. We know that. Why did we have bubbles in COVID if we didn't need more people than live in our home? Okay, we know that that's not the case. Families today are also smaller than before, fewer people are having children or having fewer children, and people live further apart, right? So the family is not, as it's currently constituted in its little safe house, a strong enough plinth, I guess, to place care on top of. So in the book, I talk about the need to reimagine the family, right? And to extend our notions of help and support beyond what seems like a kind of safety space, the family, the home, but is in fact a cage in this sense, because you don't feel you can reach out to people. You know, I give lots of, there are lots of carer stories in the book, and they speak to this, you know, people being very unsure, who would I put on like a plan if something happened to me? Who is going to step in for my parent or my husband or whatever? And so I talk about something that I call kinning. It's a word I've made up. It is what it sounds like, a verb, to kin, right? The family is a kind of stationary, static object, usually defined by biology or like legal relations. But if we learn the art of kinning with each other, so creating intentional bonds, and not expecting immediate transactional value in our interactions, then what we can have is this greater web of kind of collective support. And I give examples of that in the book. You know, there are real practical ways that we can do this, and I have done it partly in my life as well, from being a very isolated, profoundly alone carer during the time of my mum being sick. So it's about pushing beyond our comfort zones, perhaps, and finding forms of kinship. And, you know, at Humanist Convention, it feels particularly relevant because historically some of that might have been through religious institutions. And I very briefly caught a bit of the very amazing Robin Dunbar talking, and he was talking about Sunday assembly. You know, actually we need these secular practices that do kind of replicate but also reimagine the things that we used to potentially get through religious institutions, because they just were the kind of organizing infrastructure of our societies, right? So I talk about kinning, and I also talk about broader structures. Like we had mutual aid groups spring up all over the UK and indeed all over the world during COVID. There was one in my mum's area, and it was very helpful. And why did it take a pandemic, and where are they now? Some of them are still existing now, but actually that's something we need all the time, you know? You shouldn't be moving into an area and finding just a neighborhood watch. You should be finding a collective care network, because everyone on your street is going to need something at some point. We have to get over this, it's an ego-driven kind of God complex that we're somehow invulnerable.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly it, isn't it? I've had a few conversations with people while preparing for this. And a lot of people have just sort of said, well, you know, care is when you really, really need something. But, you know, there's asking for help that is actually on the same sort of spectrum. And people still don't even want to do that.
Right, this is not a muscle that we have developed very well. We need to learn to ask for help, and we need to learn to set boundaries about what help we can give. because that helps people ask for help as well, because they know you'll say no if you can't.
Yeah.
I really agree with what you're saying about, we've got this idea of care that is very extreme, and it is extreme. Look, I cared for someone through terminal cancer. I don't have a fluffy understanding of care at all. However, a lot of care isn't as extreme as that, right? And I had a wonderful chance that's written all about in the book to go and meet with the Older Women's Co-housing Project in North London. I don't know if anyone's heard of this. They're absolutely brilliant. I love them. And they live in co-housing. Co-housing means you've got private space and shared space, right? So it's not a commune. They're very clear about that. It's also not a coven, they tell me, sadly. But yeah, so they live in co-housing. It's beautiful. They've these lovely accessible flats, private gardens, shared gardens, and they have kind of systems, like if Jude is in her like pod chair in her garden, it means she doesn't want to talk to you, even if you can see her. I loved that. But so they're very clear they're not each other's carers. You know, they range in age from like 60 to 90 something. So there's obviously physical issues there. They're very clear we are not each other's carers. But when I delved into it more with them, they actually have health buddies, they do rotas. If someone breaks a limb, they'll like make meals, they have each other's biological family contacts. And so they're healing from things, and the kind of effects of their long-term illnesses are actually better because they've got this immediately built-in network of care in their daily life. They're not their family in the sense that we or the census tick boxes would understand, but they kind of also are, and they are kinning. That's what I think.
Yes, they're intentionally creating a community which is
right.
actually supportive.
Exactly.
And it isn't just focused on the acute needs
right.
of when somebody needs what you might traditionally think of as care.
Yeah.
So I mean, and I think some of the things that you've said about humanists and other religion and belief groups who organise themselves has made me wonder. I think we've got some fantastic groups within humanist society. We've got lots of local groups, we've got lots of sector interest groups. So the pastoral carers who I support have local networks, celebrants have local networks and things like that. And I wonder if there are things that we can all start to do to create that commons of care, not only amongst ourselves, but actually taking it out into our communities.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we know how we can all imagine how we would do this, right? I give one example in the book of, I don't know if anyone knows the work of Hilary Cottam here, but I love her. She's amazing. I want you to buy my book, but she has a really good book as well.
Buy both.
Buy both.
Treat yourself.
So she piloted this project, which I think should be everywhere, called Circle, which effectively was a couple of phone lines in an area. And then people in that area becoming members of it, and then they could get the support, they could ask each other for support, they could set things up, they came to know each other better. This is one of the things that people don't think about with care. The very extreme form of care, so like when someone needs intimate care, or so my mum, I'm going to say this because it doesn't get talked about enough. My mum was incontinent for quite a while actually, but very badly for the last few months of her life. And so obviously, she was a very stiff upper lip English woman. So she wasn't going to have anyone near her who wasn't basically me or her brother or sister who would sometimes come. So there weren't friends from her book group coming or the person down the street who she knew, because she didn't want to be seen like that. She didn't know what her body was going to do at any moment. It's very debilitating. Had she spent, years, months, whatever, cultivating those bonds that seem almost, initially superficial, and then there's a bit more, and then someone helps you with something, then you help them with something, and it builds and it builds and it builds over time, we would have had more help.
Yeah.
Because it is a practice.
Yeah.
You can't do it overnight.
And there's a spread of responsibility there as well. Potentially when you've got that network of support, isn't there? That it might still be the case that your mum was only comfortable with a small circle of people doing her intimate care.
Yeah.
But had there been this community around her, someone else could have got the groceries in.
Right.
Someone else could have done the gardening.
Yeah.
Taken some of the things off your plate.
Yeah.
In particular. So, one thing that was announced this week is the COVID NHS volunteer scheme, which you mentioned the things that sprung up during COVID, which was so incredibly helpful for people and really connected them with their neighbours. But they're now going to expand that NHS scheme to include something that they're calling a check-in and chat plus. to try to build this sort of community network a little bit. And I'm really interested in this sort of formalization of creating these webs, these networks.
Yeah, me too.
And whether actually that's the answer. Do we need something formal to lead this, and then we will all go, oh, actually, yeah, I quite like knowing the people who are around me.
Like, yes, this is partly why I think your work is really important. No, yeah, we do. And it's also why I say in the book, there is a chapter towards the end on what government needs to do. And there are obvious things, like I've talked about mandatory things towards employers, a livable carer's income, things like that. But we also need to be way more imaginative about the role of the government beyond paid care services, for example. So we do need the local resources and rights, the buildings, you know, the initial staff incomes and so on, to be able to instigate these collective practices that we don't have anymore. We don't even know how to do them, and we're all busy working, right? Which is why I talk about the need for shorter working weeks. So it becomes a kind of systemic, holistic approach. But absolutely, this isn't going to happen without energy, and most of our energy at the moment is directed to our paid work.
Yes, yeah. And I think that's, you know, it's quite a topical thing at the moment, isn't it, the reduction in the working week. You know, we've had the 4-day work week trials in various places, which have been extended, which have been really successful. I think there's a number of employers now who are looking at, oh, actually, you know, maybe we should give people a better work-life balance. And, I mean, I'm of the generation that I remember when I started my first paid job out of uni, we didn't have computers. And then when they started springing up everywhere, I mean, that was only like a year later. I don't look incredibly youthful for my age. People started saying, oh, well, we'll have computers at work. That means that we'll be able to get our work done in less time, so we'll be working less because this technology is enabling us. But obviously that didn't happen. We all just started doing twice as much because we had to fill 9 to 5 Monday to Friday because that was what you did. And there's this comparison, isn't there, with the advancement of technology within caregiving, enabling us to work rather than enabling us to care. And I'm not sure that the best way of us challenging that and saying quite clearly, no, this should be supportive of us rather than removing us from the equation.
Yeah, and I don't feel very positive about the future of care and technology. Like there's a load of technological assistive devices that are brilliant and useful, things like hearing aids which have fall sensors in them, so you can be alerted if your loved one's fallen. Like that kind of thing is obviously sensible and very useful. The more extreme things, honestly, I have very little hope for us in regard to them, because there are so many charities and academics and people saying we have to be really careful with this. Like, do you want to be like alone with a machine when you're, you know, older or unwell? No, it's terrifying. But, you know, it's a business, and it's very attractive for some governments because it means they don't have to think about a workforce. They don't have to think about having more migrant care workers coming in, which is obviously a political issue for lots of countries. Japan is the leader on care bots, these futuristic ones. Japan also has one of the most restrictive immigration policies. That is why they're obsessed with robots in care homes, right? So it is something that is quite terrifying. In a bizarre way, the climate crisis may be what stops that future actually arising, right? Because creating these forms of technology is very resource intensive, which the excitable labs that are creating them don't seem to be thinking about.
Yeah. Although, again, that was, you know, a stark reminder when in your book you talk about the amount of investment that's been put into this technology. And how governments can just be like, oh, I've got several £billion here that I can just, you know, we can invest in developing these care robots, but we can't possibly have paid leave for caregivers.
Right, exactly. Where is the livable carer's income? Why is it £76.75 a week at the moment? Precisely, Yeah,
the priorities there are astonishing. I realised that I could probably talk to Emily about this book for 3 or 4 days, I think, before I run out of things to say. But I'd really like to open up for some questions from you all. Oh, lovely hands. I don't know who we've got on the microphones.
There's a microphone there.
Kathy, can I get you to volunteer?
Thank you, Kathy. Oh, it's someone else.
I will also admit I can't see you particularly well. It's something to do with my glasses and this.
Three people at the back.
I'm going to start at the front here, and then we'll work our way backwards.
Hi. I volunteer, and I think a lot of us here are of the age where we have a bit of time to volunteer. I volunteer with the NHS, But I'm finding it increasingly more difficult to volunteer because they are institutionalising the volunteer system. For example, during the pandemic, they've said that we have to do the same training as the paid staff. So everything is online, which is not always easy for people to access. And it's not easy.
Yeah.
For example, the fire and safety asked me questions like, what would you do if you were required to turn the oxygen supply off for a patient and you were the last person there? I actually work in audiology, helping people with their hearing aids, and things like that. And I'm really refusing to do that training. I understand we need a certain amount of training.
Yeah.
We need to know who the fire warden is. We need to know who got the building. We need a certain amount of safeguarding. But I'm sort of concerned with what you're sort of saying, when you get these institutions, these networks come during COVID, that they're becoming so formalised, they're putting people off. And I know a lot of people who have stopped volunteering because they won't do this ridiculous training, which incidentally, all the paid staff have to do, even if it's not relevant to their jobs.
Thank you. I mean, a hugely important point, and I actually often rant to people about the professionalisation of lots of professions in health, where we used to have easier pathways, for example, to become like auxiliary nurses and things like that, and they just don't exist anymore in the same way. For me, what you're describing is a problem of the ownership structure, right? So who has made that insane choice, right? That you have to do that. And it's kind of a faceless, you know, some kind of board somewhere that you can't interact with and that you guys aren't represented on. So for me, that's a question of these ownership structures that are like not democratic and don't involve the stakeholders who are having decisions made for on their behalf. So I would like, it's a much wider political point than just on care, I would like us to be moving towards governance arrangements that the people who are affected are part of making those decisions. And I hope that you can get some common sense out of the people that have decided that and make that changed, because that's obviously...
I've just rebelled, and I'm just not doing it, and I've now not done it for 2.5 years, and
right.
they've stopped me volunteering.
Oh, well done! Okay, great, so they don't even care. Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Hi, I have a 60-year-old male colleague who is currently his dad's terminally ill. He's just been allowed to have flexible working agreements so he can compress his hours so he can spend a day a week chipping into the care for his dad, which is brilliant. I'm really lucky in that we work for an employer, because I'm a civil servant, that is very supportive in that manner. Practically, he's got a caregiver's passport. But what strikes me, and also because I helped to care for my mum when she had motor neurone disease, you get this practical support, but there doesn't seem to be much emotional support. Mm-hmm. I support him emotionally, and he knows, he was my manager when I was caring for my mum, so he knows he can talk to me about it, and we've had some quite deep and meaningful conversations about it, and he can offload on me, but not everybody's got that. And I was just wondering if you've got any thoughts on what can be provided service-wise to help people deal with the emotional and psychological impact of caring, because it can actually be quite traumatic, can't it? Some of the things that you're experiencing and seeing a loved one go through that hideous experience.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm glad that he's got you to talk to. One of the things I notice as well is that it's kind of only those of us who's been there who can talk to each other about it. And so that points towards one of the wider points, was that we just need to mature as a species that can actually talk about these things and hold difficulty for each other, which we just don't seem to be able to do. There are charities that provide support in various ways. When COVID lockdown started, I joined online peer support groups of carers, because I was very alone in the situation, especially because none of my peer group had been the primary carers for a parent at that time. And I found that really helpful. Obviously it's not enough, nothing's enough, but having that hour a week where there were these other people, it was online, so it was much easier. It was COVID, everything was online, but even now I would probably have only gone online if I was still in the situation with my mum, right? Because you can't just go somewhere. that was just so helpful to feel that sense of solidarity, but also to be able to talk about the very traumatizing things. So I noticed one of the things that came up week in, week out was people trying to navigate the shame and anger of their loved ones when they were doing intimate care for them, which is, just not a normal conversation in daily life. And obviously most counsellors are going to be like, I don't know how to help you with that. So that was, those spaces can actually be really important if it's a space where to be crying because your loved one is hiding their incontinence and you're having to deal with that. That's normal in that space, and that's very valuable. That was through Carers UK, that online thing. And there are usually local charities, like there might be a Carers Liverpool, I don't know, there's definitely Carers Leeds, and there's always local ones that probably have quite a lot of suggestions and recommendations that could support your colleague, which is also to say the problem is people don't know about these things. There aren't enough of them, yes, but we also don't know about them until we're swimming through this maelstrom of stuff and we don't have the energy to find out about them. And I've been saying that what we need is, at the point of diagnosis of that loved one or the event happening, whatever it is, we ought to be being given information, right? Just maybe we won't look at it for 6 months because we're trying to pretend it's not true, right? But at least it's there. And I didn't know half of my employment-related rights until I was researching the book after my mum had passed away, because why would, I was trying to work and look after her and then just look after her, it wasn't. So yeah, I hope something in there is helpful. Thank you.
Hi, wonderful talk, thank you. I'm curious, when you talk about political change required, you talk about the dichotomy of 5-day versus 12-week with a neonatal. Yes, we could have a large string there with what care would we allow. Do you think UBI, Universal Basic Income, could be a political change that could potentially provide the safety net for carers if they have to take unpaid leave?
So the UBI policy proposals and such like that I've always seen, notwithstanding the current full UBI pilot that Autonomy are trying to get going, if you're familiar, the ones that I've seen are usually trying to hammer home that this is like an absolute baseline, not a replacement for other types of benefits. So based on that, I think we'd still be having a conversation about the need for top-ups that are kind of substantial enough. However, I think it would be an absolute game changer in terms of our understanding of when and why people should get money, because the reason we don't have UBI is because we think people shouldn't have money unless they're doing work as constructed by GDP and capitalism. So, it would completely overhaul the culture, which could be really exciting and meaningful for carers. I worry about the amount being seen as enough, if that makes sense.
Hi, if you want to see the face of the sort of terrible bureaucrat who might make you do your fire training, I'm afraid it's me. Just a bit of it's mandatory training in all its horrible shapes and forms, and I think the broader issue is about how to engage with the NHS, and I would say I'm a former manager of NHS mental health services. I now work in the community mental health team, and yes, the NHS is a terrible bureaucracy that will drag you in and sort of suck you dry. And my advice would be that whatever voluntary networks you're getting involved in, get the protection of a third sector organisation that knows what it's doing and get into some kind of alliance contracting arrangement, because sort of going in any kind of purely voluntary basis, I think, is a risk. And it relates, I think, to a wider point that I wanted to make, which is that, you've written about the hidden crisis in caregiving. Of course, there is also the not-so-hidden crisis in the in the statutory care services. And I suppose what I was thinking of when you were talking about co-housing and kinning and all the wonderful things you could do, for God's sake, never tell health or social services about any of it. Because when they're doing the Care Act assessment, they'll be saying, well, this will definitely affect your need for statutory services and will affect your eligibility. And I suppose it's just that kind of warning, really, that there is the most terrible crisis going on at the moment. I'm sure anybody who's been involved in a Care Act assessment anywhere, and there must be loads of you, will have some sense of that. And I just think this is a really interesting but also really tricky area about how one develops other forms of support without getting them either sucked into the bureaucracy, or being used as an excuse not to fund stuff through the statutory sector.
Thank you. Yeah, it's actually one of the reasons why Ouch, the Older Women Co-housing Project, are so clear that they're not each other's carers, and that if people have advanced needs, then they have to, well, no, when you say even though they are, it's about a kind of definition, it's like a consideration of what we mean by care, which is a kind of wider point. But yeah, that is why, because they're worried about kind of the idiocy of the powers that be. I'd wanted to mention something that perhaps this isn't an audience that needs to be disabused of this, I don't know. But one of the reasons that I've written the book that I've written about unpaid carers, unpaid, ideally we wouldn't be, but family friend carers, is that often people don't realise that is the vast majority of care that is happening in the UK today. We outstrip adult social care workers 3 to 1. There are about 400,000 people in residential care homes in the UK today, 400,000 people, and there are at least 6 million unpaid carers doing care in their home or in the home of their loved one. And I noticed that there's this really, and I mean, it's obviously happening all the time because people are like, oh, you've written a book about care homes. I'm like, no, because that would be an absolute minority of care. Actually, it's about the vast majority, but the least spoken about, and that is why it's called the hidden crisis, because it's always the silenced part of this. So I thought it would be, useful to articulate that. There's someone I'm gonna...
We go to Chris, actually. You've had your hand up for a little while.
Hi, I haven't read your book, but I'm going to buy it in about 5 minutes' time, I think. It was a great talk. I've been around the care work for 40 years. I've been chief executive of a carer centre in the East End of London. I've been the chief executive of Mind. I've been through 40 years of various kinds of governments and various kinds of policies. You said we need new politicians. I don't know where we're going to get them from. They all seem to be very much the same, giving us a load of bullshit about the reform of the social care sector. It's not going to happen. It's too big. The reality for those of us who've worked in it is it's just got worse and worse and worse over the decades as we've gone through deinstitutionalization and community care and modernization and transformation and every other word you can think of. I think one of the most important things you said was about the community development aspect. The kind of caring you're talking about can only happen effectively on a local community basis. But what have we done to the third sector? We've stripped it year by year of funding. Community development in most counties and boroughs virtually doesn't exist anymore. So it is a big political issue. We have to make a political decision that we're going to go down that route, and a political decision to fund it. And yet, almost all of us, whatever our political persuasion, would be very loath to say yes to pay more taxes to enable that to happen. And any politician who proposes any substantial rise in taxation has got a cat in hell's chance of being elected. So, I'm just affirming what you're saying, that it's a very critical political issue. It's an issue about community development.
Thank you so much. And it's clear you've got that wealth of knowledge in this. Obviously I agree with you, and I would also say, I would support higher taxes to be able to provide more services, but the local community is the answer, but we have to then be very careful of what I think this gentleman was also implying about this kind of big society, voluntaristic idea where we just are responsible for everything without the resources, So how do we, and it's quite tricky to steer that path, I'm noticing that as I do events and media and things like that. I'm sometimes having what I'm saying warped as being like, well, let's all just volunteer and it'll be fine, And actually, no, it's about redistributing those resources,
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more. So the battle of the hands, please. Okay, we'll have two, as we've got two hands up.
Okay, just an observation here, which I'd appreciate your comment on. I also recently saw my dad through as a carer, as a family. So my question is, how do we turn around attitudes to caring, to seeing the positive in it, the positive we experience from being carers, rather than it being a drain or being something that's a duty, which is the overall narrative? How do we turn around in people's minds the idea this is a great thing to do and a very meaningful thing to do?
Yeah, thank you. To me, it's so tricky politically, and when I say politically, I mean like the narratives we hold. I don't mean anything to do with Westminster. It's very tricky because, so I wrote a piece in The Observer that was partly about the positive aspects of caring, because there is loads of research on it as well that I didn't feel like was known about, right? And I never read the comments, and this time I did, and I wish I hadn't. So many of the comments were people that were really angry because I didn't say anything about having direct experience myself in it, because it wasn't about me. It was like a, third-person essay. And people were like, oh, she doesn't know anything about caring. They just wanted to hear about the difficulties and the suffering because they are suffering. And I do understand that. So I think there's almost like this first phase, which is just like, hear our cry, like we do actually have to allow people to have the space to say, like, I am suffering and no one is listening. And God, if you spend enough time on, carers forums and like all of these places, and I get a lot of messages about it, it's just pain, pain, pain. And I think there's an extent to which, we've kind of got to move through that. And then to say, but look, if we could rearrange things, we could unleash these very important aspects, some of which are benefits, like feeling that you've reciprocated your parents' love if that was your childhood, or things like that. Better time management skills, apparently, lots of carers feel they have. And some of which I wouldn't call benefits, but are kind of gains. So things like, I feel that I really understand what I want to do with my life and understand its shortness in a way that I just didn't before I, held someone as they died. So how can we both be true to the difficulties while saying, if we can, downweight them, we can unleash these benefits? The problem is, when we just talk about, it's such a valuable and important thing, a lot of the time what gets done is this like valorizing piece where like, oh, they're doing such an important job, they're just heroes. And as any of us who've been carers know, that is, swear word, annoying, because it means we're like different in some way and we don't need the support that we know that we need. So it becomes this absolute, minefield where it's like, how do you say, yeah, it's valuable, it's amazing, it gives you all these things, and it's too hard as it is. And we're not very good, I think, certainly in the media, where everything is like a 30-second soundbite, at enabling those conversations. It's really hard.
Thank you. We've got time for one more, if you're super quick.
God.
To put a face to one of the tech companies trying to work in this space, that's me, so apologies. Maybe we discuss afterwards. I was going to ask about those complications between making sure it's safe and making sure someone's qualified, and then also opening it up and not then also putting a burden on a volunteer or any sort of carer. But maybe we can discuss that afterwards, because I'm constantly working through that as a difficulty. The way that I work for a company that's come out of Norway, navigating their great but quite Byzantine system, and the way that we've tried to solve it is building from the community up every time, not doing a care.com sort of top-down, everyone has the same system. But the thing that we built out of that, which is something that's not really been discussed so far, which is, even though you're being cared for in some way, that psychological bit you said at the start, in terms of someone feeling shame, not just physical, but that they need, that they're so vulnerable. And we've always span it around, so someone who's in need of care can volunteer. They've always got something to contribute, so they're never just the person in need of something. They can always give something.
Yeah.
Which is,
What is your company called?
It's called NIBI, which means...
NIBI?
NIBI.
Okay,
It's Norwegian for village.
Okay, it sounds a little bit like Hilary Cotham's circle idea that I profile in the book, but I'll look into it, because it is this idea of everyone has something to give as well as being needy. And that doesn't mean that they can do the same things as each other, but it means they can feel valued and valuable. And it sounds like it's not a dissimilar system where it's kind of a model of, local areas, people being able to kind of be humans who need and give as well. But thank you. I'm really intrigued to look into that.
Thank you. I'm afraid we have run out of time. So I'm sorry to sort of call a close on what could be really great conversation.